Fly away, my way, well, consumed the multi-million-dollar Hamptons estate, melting crystal chandeliers into toxic rain, while heavily armed bodyguards and a diamond-draped fiancé scrambled for their lives. A 22-year-old housekeeper, earning $15 an hour, did the unthinkable. She walked back into the inferno to save the deadliest man in New York. If you search the public archives of the New York Times for October 14th, you will find a brief, sanitized article about a tragic gas leak that destroyed a historic property in Southampton. The official police reports filed by the NYPD and the local fire marshal corroborate this neat, tidy lie. But in the whispered conversations of the city's elite, and within the closed-door meetings of the FBI's Organized Crime Division, the truth of that night is widely known. It wasn't a gas leak. It was a calculated, insider hit designed to wipe out Dominic Rossi, the head of the Rossi Syndicate, a man whose legitimate front Rossi Global Logistics controlled 30% of the shipping containers entering the eastern seaboard. To understand how the most powerful man in the criminal underworld ended up owing his life to a girl carrying a feather duster, you have to understand the invisible ecosystem of the ultra-rich. Genevieve Evie Miller was essentially a ghost. At 22, drowning in her mother's crushing oncology bills, Evie worked for Elite Estate Services, a boutique staffing agency that catered strictly to billionaires, foreign dignitaries, and, inevitably, high-level criminals. Elite charged its clients exorbitant fees for absolute discretion, but paid girls like Evie a fraction of the cut. Her job was to blend into the wallpaper, to scrub spilled vintage wine out of Persian rugs, and to never, ever make eye contact with the guests. On the night of the fire, Dominic Rossi was hosting his own engagement party. It was a sprawling, opulent affair designed to project absolute invincibility. Over 400 guests milled about the manicured lawns and marble halls of his waterfront mansion. Valets parked rows of Ferraris and Bentleys. The catering was outsourced to the private events team from Le Bernardin. Dominic's bride-to-be was Isabella Costa, the stunning, razor-sharp daughter of the Costa family, who controlled the Miami ports. It was an arranged alliance wrapped in white silk and Cartier diamonds. Isabella did not love Dominic. She loved his power. And Dominic, a 34-year-old man who had inherited a crumbling empire and turned it into an ironclad fortress through sheer ruthlessness, viewed her merely as a strategic asset. He was a man of cold calculation, known for his piercing dark eyes and a chilling stillness. He rarely spoke unless it was a command, and his men, led by his supposedly loyal right-hand man, Matteo Romano, feared him like a god. Evie had been assigned to the East Wing, primarily tasked with keeping the private studies and powder rooms pristine. Around 10:30 p.m., she was quietly collecting discarded champagne flutes in the corridor outside Dominic's private library. The door was slightly ajar. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the sheer venom in the voices bleeding through the crack made her freeze. "You think I want to spend the rest of my life in this freezing city playing the dutiful wife?" Isabella's voice was a harsh hiss, stripped of its public charm. "You will play whatever role secures the southern routes, Isabella," Dominic replied, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "Do not mistake my tolerance for blindness. I know about the side deals your brothers are cutting. Cross me, and the wedding is off, along with your head." Evie held her breath, pressing her back against the silk-lined wall. Suddenly, the heavy oak door swung open. Dominic stepped out, his tailored Tom Ford tuxedo impeccably neat. He stopped, his gaze snapping down to Evie, who was clutching her silver tray of dirty glasses like a shield. For a terrifying 3 seconds, time stopped. Dominic's cold, predatory eyes locked onto hers. He could have signaled a guard to have her dragged out. Instead, his gaze dropped to her hands, noting the bruised knuckles from scrubbing floors and the frantic flutter of the pulse at her throat. A strange, fleeting look of weary recognition crossed his face, a brief acknowledgement of another soul trapped in a brutal life, albeit on the opposite end of the spectrum. "Keep the door closed, sweetheart," he murmured quietly, stepping past her to rejoin a party that was entirely unaware it was about to become a slaughterhouse. Evie exhaled a shaky breath, completely oblivious to the fact that Matteo Romano had been watching the entire exchange from the shadows of the stairwell, quietly checking the time on his Rolex. It was 11:45 p.m. The countdown had already begun. The first explosion hit at precisely midnight. It was not a random blast. Military-grade C4 had been meticulously planted by Matteo's insiders along the structural load-bearing pillars of the mansion's west wing, directly beneath the grand ballroom where Dominic was supposed to be giving his midnight toast. The shockwave was apocalyptic. Evie was in the second-floor linen closet when the floor violently pitched beneath her, throwing her against shelves of Egyptian cotton towels. The deafening roar of the blast ruptured her eardrums, followed immediately by the terrifying, shrill symphony of shattering glass as hundreds of windows blew out simultaneously. Then came the gunfire. Stumbling out of the closet, coughing through the sudden, thick curtain of pulverized drywall and acrid gray smoke, Evie peered over the mahogany banister. Below her, the party had devolved into absolute carnage. Men in tactical gear, wearing unmarked black tactical vests, were pouring through the shattered French doors. The Rossi Syndicate bodyguards, the ones who hadn't been bought off by Matteo, were caught in a deadly crossfire. But Evie's eyes were drawn to the chaos near the front entrance. Guests were trampling each other to escape. Women were kicking off their designer heels, screaming as they scrambled over the bloodied marble floors. Among them, Evie spotted Matteo Romano, shielded by 3 men, shoving his way out the door without a backward glance. Where was Dominic? A second explosion, smaller but closer, rocked the east wing. The fire alarm finally kicked in, its piercing shrieks adding to the pandemonium. Black smoke began to billow from the corridor leading to Dominic's private library. Evie knew she had to run. The servants' stairs were right behind her, leading directly out to the safe haven of the back gardens. She took a step toward survival, but a frantic movement caught her eye. Isabella Costa sprinted out of the East Wing corridor, her custom Oscar de la Renta gown torn, her face smeared with soot. She paused at the top of the grand staircase, looking back toward the library. "Isabella, help me!" a voice rasped from the smoke. It was Dominic. Evie watched in stunned horror as Isabella stared into the thick black smoke. The Miami cartel princess didn't call for the guards. She didn't run to her fiancé and Devulaber. Instead, she reached up, unclasped the heavy, multi-million-dollar diamond necklace Dominic had given her, shoved it into her cleavage, and ran down the stairs, abandoning him to the flames. Evie stood paralyzed. Survival instincts screamed at her to flee. She owed this man nothing. He was a criminal, a monster who dealt in violence and intimidation. If he died, the world would likely be a safer place. But the image of Isabella's cold, calculating betrayal triggered something deep within Evie. She remembered the crushing feeling of her own father walking out when her mother got sick. She remembered what it felt like to be abandoned when you needed someone most. "Damn it," Evie whispered, pulling the collar of her uniform over her nose and mouth. Instead of running down the back stairs, she plunged into the burning corridor. The heat was suffocating, an oppressive physical weight that seared her lungs. The pristine walls were blistering, the expensive artwork curling and turning to ash. When Evie finally reached the library, she gasped. A massive section of the ornate ceiling had caved in. Dominic was pinned beneath a heavy, burning oak beam. Blood poured from a vicious gash on his forehead, blinding him, and his left leg was trapped under the debris. He was straining against the wood, his muscles trembling with exertion, but it was too heavy. He stopped struggling when he saw a figure emerge from the smoke. He expected a bullet. He expected Matteo to finish the job. Instead, he saw the terrified face of the 22-year-old Maid. "What are you doing?" he choked out, coughing up black soot. "Get out of here." Evie didn't answer. She rushed to his side, the heat radiating off the burning beam, singeing her eyebrows. She grabbed the edge of the wood, ignoring the searing pain in her palms as the wood burned her skin. "When I count to 3, "You have to pull your leg out," she screamed over the roar of the fire. "You can't lift this, you idiot. Run," Dominic snarled, furious that this girl was throwing her life away for a dead man. "Shut up and pull," Evie screamed back, a terrifying, feral sound. 1, 2, 3. Driven by pure, unadulterated adrenaline, Evie hoisted the beam. Her muscles tore, her joints screamed, and the smell of burning flesh, her own flesh, filled the air. For a split second, the heavy timber shifted upward just enough. Dominic, fueled by desperation, wrenched his leg free with a sickening crack. The beam slammed back down, taking a chunk of Evie's uniform with it. Dominic collapsed to the floor, panting, his leg clearly broken. The room was moments away from a flashover. Without hesitation, Evie dropped to her knees, grabbed the lapels of his ruined Tom Ford tuxedo, and began to drag him. He was dead weight, over 200 pounds of dense muscle, but Evie pulled with a manic, singular focus. Out of the library, down the suffocating hallway. Every inch felt like a mile. Dominic tried to push himself along with his good leg, his blood leaving a wide red streak across the marble floor. Left, he managed to gasp, his consciousness fading. Servant stairs. Reinforced concrete. Evie hauled him into the narrow, unglamorous stairwell, designed specifically so the elite wouldn't have to see the hired help. Right now, it was their only sanctuary. The concrete walls offered a temporary buffer from the inferno. Step by step, she dragged the Mafia boss down, the sounds of distant sirens and dying men muffled by the thick walls. When they finally burst out of the heavy steel exit door at the bottom, the cold October air hit them like a physical blow. Evie dragged him across the wet grass, pulling him deep into the manicured hedges near the perimeter wall, far from the light of the burning mansion. She collapsed beside him in the mud, her hands blistered and bleeding, her lungs burning as she gasped for oxygen. The grand estate was fully engulfed now, a towering inferno, painting the night sky violently orange. Dominic lay on his back, staring up at the smoke-choked stars. He slowly turned his head to look at the girl gasping for air beside him. His fiancée had left him to burn. His closest friend had orchestrated his murder. His elite guards had fled. But the invisible girl had walked into the fire. "Why?" Dominic whispered, his voice cracking, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a frightening intensity. Evie looked at the burning wreckage of his empire, wiped soot from her forehead with a trembling, burned hand, and gave a hollow, exhausted laugh. "Because I hate messes," she said, before passing out cold in the grass. The transition from unconsciousness to waking was not a gentle drift, but a violent tear. Evie gasped, her eyes flying open to stark, blinding fluorescent lights. The smell of smoke and charred meat was gone, replaced by the sterile, biting chemical odor of chlorhexidine and medical-grade alcohol. She tried to sit up, but her body felt as though it had been fed through a commercial trash compactor. A sharp, localized agony flared in her hands. Looking down, she saw both her arms wrapped in thick, white gauze from the mid-forearm to the fingertips, the dressings stained with a faint yellowish ointment. "I wouldn't try to move the fingers yet. You sustained second-degree burns, borderline third, on your palmar surfaces. The silver sulfadiazine needs time to work." The voice was calm, clipped, and deeply educated. Evie turned her head, her neck screaming in protest. Sitting in a leather chair beside her Hillroom hospital bed was a man in his late 50s, wearing a pristine white coat over a bespoke Brioni suit. He did not look like an emergency room doctor. He looked like a Wall Street executive who dabbled in surgery. "Where am I?" Evie croaked, her throat raw from inhaling pulverized drywall and toxic smoke. "Mount Sinai? New York Presbyterian? You are currently 50 feet underground in a decommissioned Cold War bunker located beneath a private horse farm in Dutchess County," the doctor replied smoothly. "Checking a state-of-the-art Draeger vital signs monitor. My name is Dr. Harrison Sterling. I am a private physician on retainer for Mr. Rossi. You have been unconscious, heavily sedated for 3 days. 3 days." The words hit Evie like a physical blow. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of painkillers. My mother, Evie, choked out, struggling to push herself up with her elbows since her hands were useless. She's at the oncology ward at Sloan Kettering. If I miss my shifts at the agency, I default on the payment plan. They'll discharge her. I have to go. Where are my clothes? Your clothes were incinerated, Miss Miller, a new voice answered from the shadows of the room. The sound of that low, gravelly baritone made the hair on Evie's arms stand up. The mechanized hum of a motorized wheelchair preceded him as Dominic Rossi emerged into the light. He was a battered, broken monument of a man. His left leg was encased in a heavy halo-pin external fixator, the metal rods screwed directly into his shattered tibia. The left side of his face was covered in a specialized burn mask, but his visible right eye dark, calculating, and predatory fixed on her with unblinking intensity. He looked less like a mafia boss and more like a warlord surviving the apocalypse. "You can't go to Sloan Kettering," Dominic stated, stopping the chair at the foot of her bed. "You can't go to your apartment in Queens. You can't call your mother. As of yesterday morning, Genevieve Miller is dead." Evie stared at him, her chest heaving. "What are you talking about? I saved your life." "And in doing so, you forfeited your own," Dominic replied coldly, though there was a flicker of something resembling regret in his dark eye. He tapped a button on the armrest of his chair, and a flat-screen television mounted on the concrete wall flickered to life. It was a recording of a CNN broadcast. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Tragedy in Southampton, 47. Dead in gas explosion at billionaire's estate." The screen shifted to live footage of the steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan. Standing at a podium surrounded by a sea of black umbrellas and federal agents was Matteo Romano. The man who had orchestrated the bombing looked thoroughly devastated. He was weeping, wiping tears from his eyes, as he spoke into the microphones. Beside him, clinging to his arm in a display of performative grief, was Isabella Costa, draped in a black veil and wearing the very same diamond necklace she had saved instead of her fiancé. "Dominic was more than a business partner. He was my brother." Matteo's voice echoed through the underground clinic, dripping with rehearsed sorrow. "His loss leaves a void in the Rossi Global Enterprise, but I swear on his memory that we will rebuild. Isabella and I, united in our grief, will ensure his legacy survives." Dominic muted the television. The silence in the bunker was deafening. He declared himself the new head of the Rossi Syndicate and finalized the merger with the Costa Cartel before my ashes were even supposedly cold, Dominic said, his voice a lethal, quiet whisper. They recovered 47 bodies from the rubble. Most were burned beyond recognition. The medical examiner, who is currently on Matteo's payroll, officially identified 2 of the remains as myself and you. You were the girl in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Then let me just slip away," Evie pleaded, tears of pure frustration and fear finally spilling over. "I won't tell anyone. I don't care about your mafia wars. I just need to take care of my mother." Dominic leaned forward, the metal of his wheelchair groaning. "You don't understand, Evie. Matteo is thorough. He ordered a hit that took out half the Eastern Seaboard's underworld elite just to guarantee I died. If he finds out I am breathing, he will hunt me to the ends of the earth. And if he finds out a 22-year-old maid dragged me out of the fire, he won't just kill you. He will send his men to Sloan Kettering. They will smother your mother with a pillow, and they will make you watch before they flay you alive. Your anonymity is the only thing keeping her breathing." Evie felt all the oxygen leave the room. She slumped back against the pillows, the reality of her nightmare settling over her like a suffocating shroud. She was trapped in the underworld she had only ever scrubbed the floors of. "So what now?" she whispered into the sterile air. "We just hide in a hole while the man who murdered your friends runs the city?" Dominic's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his bandages. "No, we heal, and then we take back what is mine. But to do that, I need someone who doesn't exist. I need a ghost." 3 weeks in the subterranean bunker dragged by in a blur of agonizing physical therapy and forced proximity. The heavy silver sulfadiazine bandages on Evie's hands were replaced by sleek compression gloves. The skin beneath was a landscape of pale, tight scars, but she had regained her dexterity. Dominic, meanwhile, operated his broken empire from a bank of encrypted laptops, fueled by black coffee and a terrifying cold rage. The dynamic between them was jagged. Evie refused to be submissive. She was a hostage to circumstance, and she made sure Dominic knew it. When he barked orders at her to fetch his pain medication or review encrypted logistical manifests he couldn't decipher with his blurred vision, she fired back with biting sarcasm, unafraid of the monster everyone else cowered before. She had seen him broken and bleeding. The mystique of the ruthless Don had burned away in the Hamptons. "You hold the pen like it's going to bite you," Dominic remarked one evening. He was sitting at a massive mahogany desk they had imported into the bunker, his leg resting on a stool. He was watching Evie struggle to sign a stack of forged documents. "My skin is still adjusting to not being melted to my bones," Evie snapped, tossing the Mont Blanc pen onto the desk. "And maybe if you weren't trying to forge my signature on a Cayman Islands shell company document, I'd have an easier time." Dominic didn't smile, he rarely did, but a look of profound respect crossed his scarred face. "The identity Dr. Sterling procured for you is ironclad. From tomorrow, you are Chloe Vance." Evie held up a scarred hand. "Don't use the name Vance. I had an uncle named Vance who stole my mother's car. Give me something else." Dominic paused, slightly taken aback by her interruption. "Fine. Chloe. Sterling. A high-end art appraiser from London. The passport is biometric proof. Tomorrow, you are going into Manhattan." Evie froze. "Manhattan? You said if Mateo's men see me?" "Mateo's men are looking for a terrified, exhausted maid in a cheap uniform," Dominic interrupted, sliding a sleek, black leather folder across the desk. "They are not looking for a woman wearing a $5,000 Chanel suit, stepping out of a blacked-out Mercedes Maybach. You are going to the International Gem Tower on 47th Street. Beneath it is a private, unlisted vault, operated by a Swiss conglomerate. I have a safety deposit box there that Mateo doesn't know about. It contains $50 million in untraceable bearer bonds and a physical ledger of every corrupt politician, judge, and Port Authority official on Mateo's payroll." "Why me?" Evie asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You have Arthur. You have guards. My surviving men are flagged. Facial recognition at the vault will trigger an alert to the syndicate if any known associate of mine walks through the doors. I am legally dead, so my biometrics are locked out. But the box has a secondary access protocol, a physical key, and a blind passphrase. You are completely off the grid." The next morning, the transformation was jarring. A professional stylist, smuggled into the bunker blindfolded, spent 4 hours turning the invisible housekeeper into a predator of the elite class. Her mousy brown hair was dyed a striking, icy blonde and styled in a sharp bob. The Chanel suit acted as armor. As she looked in the mirror, Evie didn't recognize the woman staring back. "Remember the rules," Dominic said as she stood by the private elevator that would take her to the surface. He leaned heavily on a titanium cane, standing inches from her. The proximity sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. The scent of his expensive cologne, mixed with the faint, metallic tang of danger. "Don't break character. You belong there. Arrogance is the best camouflage for the ultra-rich." The operation went flawlessly at first. Evie navigated the high-security protocols of the Gem Tower vault with the cold, haughty demeanor she had spent years observing in the billionaires she used to serve. The G4S security contractors didn't give her a second glance. She accessed the steel-reinforced room, used the heavy brass key Dominic had given her, and opened box 814. Inside were the thick stacks of bearer bonds and a leather-bound ledger. But as she reached to grab the book, her scarred fingers knocked over a stack of manila folders at the back of the box. They spilled open onto the metal table. Evie froze. The top document was a corporate structuring charter. The header bore the logo of Rossi Global Logistics, but it was the subsidiary company listed beneath it that made the blood drain from Evie's face. Elite Estate Services, her staffing agency. Evie frantically flipped through the documents. It was all there. Elite Estate Services was a ghost company, a sophisticated money laundering front created by the Rossi Syndicate. They targeted vulnerable, desperate women, women with sick parents, crushing debts, or criminal records, and trapped them in predatory employment contracts. The agency skimmed 70% of their wages to wash cartel money through payroll taxes. And then she saw the memo, dated 5 years ago. It detailed a hostile takeover of a medium-sized municipal pension fund to liquidate its assets for cash flow. The fund belonged to the New York public school system. Her mother had been a public school teacher for 30 years before the pension fund inexplicably went bankrupt, destroying her safety net right before the cancer diagnosis. Dominic hadn't just been the man whose life she saved. He was the architect of the very system that had destroyed her family's life. Evie shoved the bonds, the ledger, and the corporate documents into her leather briefcase. The ride back to Dutchess County was a blur of blinding, white-hot fury. She didn't feel fear anymore. The awe of the Mafia boss was completely eradicated. When the elevator doors opened into the bunker, Dominic was waiting, a rare look of anticipation on his face. "Do you have the ledger?" he asked, taking a step forward on his cane. Evie walked slowly toward him, her heels clicking ominously on the concrete floor. She didn't hand him the briefcase. Instead, she unclasped it, reached inside, and pulled out the Rossi Global Logistics corporate charter. She slapped it directly onto his chest. Dominic caught the paper as it fluttered down, his brow furrowing. He looked at the document, then up at Evie's face, which was twisted in a mask of pure hatred. "Elite Estate Services," Evie whispered, her voice trembling with a rage so profound it shook her entire frame. "You owned my agency. You drained my mother's pension fund 5 years ago to cover a bad shipment of weapons, didn't you? You built your empire on the bones of people like me." Dominic looked at the paper, a muscle jumping in his jaw. The silence in the bunker was thicker, heavier than the smoke in the burning mansion. He didn't deny it. He didn't offer a platitude. He was a monster, and he knew it. "I signed off on thousands of liquidations, Evie," he said quietly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "It was business." "Business?" Evie let out a dark, broken laugh, stepping so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. "My mother is dying in a public ward because of your business. I scrubbed blood out of your rugs for $15 an hour to pay for the damage you caused." She shoved him, hard, in the chest. Dominic stumbled back a half step, his cane clicking against the floor, but he didn't raise a hand to stop her. "I should have left you under that beam," she spat, tears of pure betrayal hot on her cheeks. "I traded my life for the man who ruined it." Dominic looked down at her, the cold, calculating Mafia Don entirely stripped away, leaving only a man confronting the human collateral of his own ruthlessness. "You're right," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly timbre. He reached out, his large hand gently wrapping around her scarred wrist, pulling her slightly closer. "I am the villain of your story, Genevieve. I destroyed your past. But Matteo Romano is currently trying to destroy your future. If you want vengeance for your mother, you don't do it by walking away. You do it by helping me burn his empire to the ground. And when the ash settles, you can take my millions and destroy me too." Evie did not strike him. She did not scream. The raw, bleeding wound of her mother's ruined life and the agonizing burns on her hands crystallized into something far more dangerous than grief. It hardened into absolute, freezing clarity. "I don't just want your millions, Dominic," Evie said, her voice dropping to a dead, hollow calm that made even the seasoned crime boss blink. "I want the entire network. Every shell company, every offshore account, every crooked politician who looked the other way while your syndicate cannibalized the working class. I want Matteo's head on a platter. And then I want the keys to the kingdom. If I am going to be a ghost, I am going to be the one that haunts this city." A slow, terrifying smile, the first she had ever seen, pulled at the scarred left side of Dominic's face. "Then we have an agreement, Miss Sterling." 6 weeks later, the Baccarat Hotel in Midtown Manhattan was closed to the public. The grand ballroom, dripping with multi-million-dollar crystal chandeliers, and thousands of imported black roses, was the staging ground for the most exclusive, high-security event of the decade. It was the Winter Gala, but the federal agents parked in unmarked surveillance vans outside knew what it really was: the formal coronation of Matteo Romano and the sealing of the Rossi Costa cartel merger. Inside the Grand Salon, the air was thick with the scent of Tom Ford cologne, expensive champagne, and blood money. Wall Street hedge fund managers rubbed shoulders with Miami narcotics suppliers. Security was impenetrable, managed by a private, heavily armed military contractor. No weapons, no unauthorized personnel, and absolutely no ghosts. Evie stepped out of the private elevator on the VIP floor, bypassing the ballroom entirely. She wore a backless, blood-red Alexander McQueen gown that fit her like a second skin. Her burned hands and forearms were concealed beneath elegant, elbow-length black silk gloves. She moved with the predatory grace of a woman who owned the building, her icy blonde hair catching the dim, amber lighting of the corridor. She approached the heavy oak doors of the presidential suite. 4 massive men in tailored suits stepped in her path. "Private meeting," the lead guard grunted, crossing his arms. Evie didn't flinch. She simply held up her matte black leather briefcase. "Tell Mr. Romano that Chloe Sterling is here representing the Zurich Consortium. Tell him I brought the $50 million in bearer bonds he requested to lubricate the Miami port expansion. If he makes me wait out here for another 10 seconds, my clients will pull the funding, and he can explain the deficit to the Costa family." The guard hesitated, tapped his earpiece, and muttered a message. A moment later, the heavy doors swung open. The presidential suite was a monument to excess, boasting floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline. Matteo Romano sat behind a massive glass desk, a snifter of Louis XIII cognac in his hand. Beside him stood Isabella Costa, dripping in diamonds, including the heavy, familiar Cartier necklace she had stolen from Dominic the night of the fire. "Miss Sterling," Matteo smiled smoothly, though his eyes were sharp and suspicious. "Your employers in Zurich are notoriously reclusive. I wasn't expecting an in-person delivery." "My employers prefer guarantees, Mr. Romano," Evie said smoothly, walking to the desk. She placed the briefcase down and popped the gold latches. She spun it around, revealing the dense, pristine stacks of bearer bonds. $50 million, untraceable. "But before we transfer the serial numbers, my clients require a gesture of good faith. They need to see the corporate structuring ledger to ensure Rossi Global Logistics is fully solvent under your new management." Matteo's smile faltered. "The master ledger is highly classified." "So is my $50 million, Evie countered, her voice dropping to a silken threat. "No ledger, no deal." Matteo weighed his greed against his caution. Greed won. He walked over to a biometric wall safe hidden behind a framed original Picasso, pressed his thumb to the scanner, and pulled out a heavy black leather book. He tossed it onto the glass desk next to the money. "Everything is perfectly solvent," Matteo declared arrogantly. "Dominic Rossi was a brilliant architect, but he lacked vision. I have streamlined the operation." Dominic Rossi lacked many things. A low, gravelly voice echoed from the shadows of the suite's private master bedroom. But he never lacked the ability to spot a rat. The blood completely drained from Matteo's face. Isabella gasped, taking a stumbling step backward, her manicured hand flying to her throat. The bedroom doors opened fully. Dominic stepped into the light of the Manhattan skyline. He leaned heavily on a custom carbon fiber cane, his left leg braced beneath his bespoke suit. The burn mask was gone, revealing the jagged, brutal scars that marred the left side of his face. He looked like a demon summoned directly from hell, clutching a suppressed Heckler & Koch USP tactical pistol. "Dominic," Matteo choked out, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He lunged toward his desk drawer, where he kept his panic button and a revolver. Dominic didn't even blink. He raised the weapon and fired once. The suppressed gunshot was a sharp, mechanical thwip. The bullet shattered Matteo's kneecap. The new head of the syndicate collapsed to the Persian rug, screaming in agony, knocking the glass table and scattering the bearer bonds across the floor. "Security!" Isabella shrieked, sprinting toward the heavy oak doors. They won't answer, Isabella, Evie said calmly, stepping perfectly into Isabella's path. The men in the hall were bought off 10 minutes ago, with the promise of immunity and a share of the Zurich bonds. You're completely alone. Isabella stared at Evie, her eyes frantically scanning the blonde hair, the sharp features, and finally dropping to the black silk gloves. Recognition, horrifying and slow, dawned on the cartel princess. You, Isabella whispered, her voice trembling. The girl in the hallway, the maid. Genevieve Miller died in the fire you left us in, Evie replied. She stepped closer, her burned hands aching beneath the silk. With a swift, unapologetic motion, Evie reached out and ripped the Cartier diamond necklace right off Isabella's neck. The clasp snapped, scraping Isabella's skin. This belongs to a ghost. Matteo was writhing on the floor, clutching his shattered knee, his blood soaking the expensive rug. Dom, please, he begged, spitting blood. We were brothers. It was business. Just business. Dominic limped forward, the tip of his cane pressing ruthlessly against Matteo's bleeding leg, forcing another scream from the traitor's lungs. Dominic looked down at him with eyes entirely devoid of humanity. You're right, Matteo, Dominic whispered, aiming the barrel of the gun directly at his former friend's forehead. It was business. Another sharp thwip echoed through the suite. Matteo Romano went perfectly still. Isabella clamped her hands over her mouth, stifling a hysterical scream, sinking to her knees amidst the scattered millions. Dominic didn't look at the body. He turned to Evie, who was already calmly sliding the master ledger and the bearer bonds back into the briefcase. She didn't shake. She didn't cry. The fire in the Hamptons had burned away whatever fragile, frightened girl used to exist. Leave her, Evie said, glancing at the sobbing Isabella. The FBI has the encrypted files I sent them an hour ago regarding her family's port operations. Let the feds tear the Costa cartel apart. We have a flight to catch. Dominic lowered the weapon, a profound, dark reverence in his gaze as he looked at the woman who had dragged him from the ashes. He offered her his arm. Evie took it, her silk-gloved hand resting over the scars of his wrist. Together, they walked out of the suite, leaving the ruined remains of their enemies behind them in the dark. Police reports state Matteo Romano died resisting arrest during a massive federal raid, while Dominic Rossi remains a tragic victim of the Hamptons fire. In truth, Dominic rules the underworld from the shadows, an unseen king. Beside him sits Evie, no longer an invisible maid, but the ruthless queen of a reborn empire. She saved a monster from the flames, only to discover she was born to wield his fire.